Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amit, and today we are going to talk about three types of integration tool every Salesforce professional should know. And we have a great speaker, Brian, with us. So let me hand over him for the presentation and the session.
Awesome. Thanks, Amit. Always great to be on Apex Hours. Appreciate the invite and looking forward to this session. So today I'm going to be talking about three types of integration tools that every Salesforce professional should know or should know about or be familiar with. And real quick about me, my name is Brian Shea. I'm a 15X certified Salesforce architect. I've been an independent Salesforce consultant for 12 years, and I've been building CRM systems for 20 years now. And you can find me on Twitter at this Brian Shea, and you can also find me on LinkedIn. So today we're going to be talking about three types of integration tools, okay? And the three types that we're going to be covering, number one are task automation tools. Number two is middleware. And the third are platforms or platform as a service. All right, so introduction to kind of frame up this discussion. So when we're talking about integration tools, we're talking about tools that enable systems to share information or share data across systems or across applications. Okay, and when we're sharing data across systems, these could be running on a schedule, right? Like a nightly batch job, that kind of thing, bulk data shared across systems once a day, or it could be more of a trigger-based approach where it's happening in real time or near real time. We are talking about data integration and also process integration, which are similar, but I'll call out the distinction. When we talk about data integration, we're talking about obviously sharing data between systems, like a sort of a nightly ETL job would be an example of data integration, where we're taking data from one system and we're moving it to another system. Process integration also involves sharing of data, but there's a little bit of a distinction. Process integration involves sort of workflow as well. So the data that's being exchanged is happening as part of a workflow or a process. So, for example, an opportunity is closed won in Salesforce, and that triggers some data to be shared with another system, like an ERP system or something like that. So for today, we're talking about data integration and process integration, and we're kind of the scope of our discussion today are tools that enable some type of sort of custom configuration. Okay, so we're not talking about sort of pre-built connectors or app exchange apps that are sort of out of the box and have limited configuration capability. We're talking about tools that allow you to sort of define your custom logic, your object and field mapping, possibly handle some workflow, those kind of things. So that is our scope of our discussion today. And who this presentation is for. So this is for Salesforce professionals generally. This is not specific to architects or developers. This is for an audience that does not need previous development experience or integration experience. So we're going to keep it pretty high level, and we will not go in detail into any particular tool. We're going to kind of be talking about categories here. I'll use some examples of particular tools in each of the categories, but we're going to be talking more at a category level than specific features on specific tools or specific technologies. All right, so the three categories that I mentioned before, task automation tools, middleware, and platforms. I'll go through each of them and kind of give sort of an intro to each. So first, task automation tools. These are your things, your tools like Zapier, MuleSoft Composer, that particular product within the sort of MuleSoft family. MuleSoft Composer is a task automation tool. If This Then That, which is sort of an older one. These are tools that are, in general, relatively sort of simple and in the grand scheme of things. And they're really about taking a task from one system to trigger an automation to happen, and then sending data to another system um, based on that trigger that happens. So relatively simple tools that are based on kind of automating tasks across systems. Middleware, another term that you might hear for some of these middleware tools or these cloud middleware tools, are iPaaS, or integration platform as a service. So some examples here are Boomi, MuleSoft Anypoint Platform. So a lot of times when people talk about MuleSoft, they're talking about MuleSoft Anypoint Platform, which is sort of the enterprise middleware iPaaS product for MuleSoft. Informatica is another one. So these are tools that are kind of more complex in general than our task automation tools. They provide more capabilities. They support different types of integrations. So not just sort of simple task-based integrations, but there's patterns like pub sub that I'll talk about, ETL, sort of moving bulk data across systems in a scheduled fashion, or a ETL, extract, transform, load fashion. Um, so these middleware tools are more complex, more capabilities. I'll talk about those in detail in a minute. And then our third type is platforms as a service. Okay, so some ones that you're probably familiar with the big three: AWS, Google Cloud Platform, and Azure. So these tools also have integration capabilities. You have the ability to use these to develop integrations, and I will talk about those. And as I mentioned, in general, as we go from left to right, we have sort of more capabilities and also sort of more complexity. They get more complicated to develop as we go from the left to the right. All right, so number one, task automation tools. As I mentioned, If This Then That is example. Zapier is, I'd say, probably the most common one that I've seen. MuleSoft Composer is another one. So as I mentioned, these are meant to automate tasks across systems. So if we think about somebody who is, without using these systems, needing to input data into multiple systems. So we need to, I don't know, close an opportunity in Salesforce, and then also enter sort of the same data into our ERP system. That's sort of what these task automation tools have in mind for automating. They're trigger based, which means something happens in one system and it causes data to be shared with another system. So the example again of an opportunity being closed, that's kind of our trigger, and that causes data to be passed to another system. It's important to call out here that while these tools may be trigger based, they're not, the data sharing that's happened might not necessarily be happening in real time. So what do I mean by that? So for some of these tools, Zapier is one example. Some of their triggers are not real-time triggers, but they're called, they use the term polling triggers, which means that something can happen in one system, but Zapier isn't sort of listening in real time. It kind of polls that triggering system it could be every 5 minutes, every 2 minutes, every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes. It depends on the particular trigger that you're using, but it's not necessarily happening in real time. So that's something that to be aware of, because sometimes people are surprised. They think trigger based and they think real time or near real time. But uh, some of these tools in particular situations can be actually um, can have a significant delay, like 15 minutes, depending on your use case, could be a significant delay. So that's something to be aware of. For Zapier, sort of the higher price point you get, sort of for some of these triggers, the faster the polling increments. So at a more basic plan, you might have a 15-minute polling interval, and the more you go up, it might get down to I think like 2 minutes or a minute or something. So that's something to be aware of. Pricing for these tools is often based on the number of tasks. So the pricing might look like, okay, you get 1,000 tasks per month, which means that 1,000 triggers per month, essentially. Um, and the pricing is often based on that, where at various tiers, the more as you go up tiers, more expensive tiers, the more tasks you're getting per month. These task automation tools are generally for kind of a point-to-point architecture, which means we're connecting one application, one source application with one target application. So the more sources and the more targets that you set up, you're needing to create new integrations for each source and for each target. So that's a process that might work sort of in a simple architecture where there's not a whole lot of source and target applications, but as you get more complex, that point-to-point architecture doesn't scale as well. When we get to the middleware section, you'll see an example of a architecture that does scale a little bit better. Generally speaking, these tools are geared toward, I'd say, almost kind of tech-savvy business users, or as they call them, citizen developers. So these are tools that are meant to be kind of as user-friendly as possible, very point-and-click oriented, and that kind of thing. All right, some limitations around the task automation tools. Oftentimes they will have kind of limited transformation capability. So a limited ability to process complex data structures. So, they may work for a sort of a basic situation where, okay, we have an opportunity that's closed. One, we need to take a couple of data points and we need to pass it over to another system, to an ERP system or something. That could be a relatively simple um, data mapping and very little logic that needs to happen um, to pass it to the target system. But if we think of a more complex situation where maybe the trigger is the opportunity closing, but we need to take data from 3 or 4 different objects, we need to transform it or manipulate it in some way, we need to do some mapping. That's more complex, kind of possibly like a nested object structure. That's a kind of situation where these task automation tools might not be a great fit for a situation like that. And then limited error notification, monitoring, or logging. So one of the complexities of building integrations is how we handle error notifications, monitoring, logging of errors. If something fails, how do we retry it? So for folks that most of their experience is kind of within Salesforce, when you're working within Salesforce, a lot of this stuff around error handling and retrying, Salesforce kind of manages, and you don't really need to worry about it in the same way as you do with developing integrations. So this is an important capability to keep in mind when you're building integrations. You're thinking about the tools that you should use, is the error handling and retrying capabilities. So on the task automation tools, generally speaking, there's sort of limited capabilities in this area. It can vary. I know like MuleSoft Composer has better capabilities than some of the sort of other more basic tools that I listed, like Zapier. But in general, in this category, kind of error handling, the ability to retry a transaction or retry a task if it sort of failed along the way, there's not a whole lot of, oftentimes not a whole lot of capability built into these task automation tools. So something to be aware of there. All right, so to use an example to kind of illustrate a sort of workflow that we might use for a task automation tool, this is a situation where we have Asana, which is a project management tool. That is our source system. We have Service Cloud, which is our target system, and we have Zapier, which is our integration tool, our task automation tool. So in this situation, we have a task created in Asana. Zapier is listening for that event that happens. Zapier authenticates to Service Cloud, and it maps the data from the task into the objects in Salesforce. And in this example, very simple example, it's creating an account and it's creating a case. Okay, so pretty simple. And this is the kind of often the kind of thing that you'd see with a task automation tool. One object or one record in our source system, one or two objects or records created in our target system. And to show you kind of, this is a screenshot of the Zapier canvas. It kind of gives you a sense of how it works as a tool. It's sort of similar to folks that use Flow. It's kind of a similar like drag and drop canvas where you have certain actions that are happening. You drag them onto the canvas, you configure the actions. So in this example, we've got, we're using a webhook. So Asana sends a webhook to Zapier. Zapier then formats the data that's coming in. It's like a text processing formatting kind of a thing. Zapier is going back out to Asana to get additional information about that task, kind of enrich the data, and then the target system is Salesforce, and Zapier is creating, in this case, creating an account or a case based on that. So again, relatively straightforward, drag and drop canvas. This one doesn't show it here, but there is capability within a tool like Zapier and many of the other ones to kind of have some branching logic. But we're talking about relatively basic workflows, relatively basic sort of capability to do error handling and those kinds of things. All right, so our second category is middleware or integration platform as a service. Okay, so we're getting into a little bit more complexity, a little bit more capability here. So some examples: Boomi, MuleSoft, Anypoint Platform, Informatica. These are three examples. There are more. These tools are low code, in general, low code and pro code. They may have that sort of drag and drop, point and click canvas capability that you saw in the previous category, but also have a lot more capabilities to do sort of real developer grade operations. like for example, with MuleSoft using data weave to manipulate your data as it comes in or goes out. And in the previous category, I had mentioned that generally we're building point-to-point integrations. So for each new source system or target system, we're needing to create a new integration. These types of middleware tools allow us to build things that are kind of reusable across applications. They scale quite a bit better. I'll show that in one of my examples. With these tools, we've got different integration styles supported. Okay, so I'm going to show you a publish and subscribe example, show you a extract, transform, and load example. So different types of patterns, different types of integration scenarios. A lot more ability to pick the style that works in your particular use case. We can do much more complex data transformation using these tools, and we've got enterprise-grade error handling and the ability to retry transactions if they fail. Okay, so in our first example of middleware example, this is a publish and subscribe architecture. So I will talk through what this is and why it matters. So if we look at this example, we're using Boomi as our middleware tool, okay? And on the left-hand side, we have our source systems, and on the right-hand side, we have our target systems, okay? And what this example is illustrating is we have these source systems or publisher systems that are creating accounts or creating companies, depending what terminology our system uses, creating, in Salesforce parlance, accounts, okay? And we have systems that may want to be aware of an account being created in one of those source systems and may want to do something based on that. So example, if an account's created in Salesforce, we may have an ERP system or ERP systems that want to be aware of that because those systems want to create corresponding customers or corresponding accounts. Okay. So an important thing to call out here is if you notice, we have multiple source systems, multiple, as the term is, publishers, okay, and we have multiple subscribers. So in our previous example where we had a point-to-point situation with Zapier, in this example, we have a sort of a single integration that multiple systems as publishers and as subscribers can use. So it's something that scales quite a bit better than our point-to-point example previously. And one other point to call out here is with our publishers, we'll use an example of a subscriber. Each subscriber can take this information and use it the way that application wants to use it. And each publisher can sort of publish independently. So this is a much more, this is again, a much more kind of scalable system in that what these systems are doing on the left and what each of these systems are doing on the right are what's called decoupled from each other. So if there's, so anything that each of these systems can kind of act independently without being sort of concerned with what the other systems are doing. So that's one example of a type of integration we would use in middleware. And another one, which is quite different, is what's called extract, transform, and load, or people call it ETL. And this is a common pattern that's used to populate data warehouses. So like a system that's used for business intelligence or reporting, a data warehouse, which may be just a relational database like SQL Server or Postgres, or maybe a data warehouse platform like Snowflake or Google BigQuery. But the way these traditionally work is you have one or more data source systems, and on some schedule, that data, on sort of a bulk data basis, is taken from the source system and loaded into our data warehouse. So if we look at this example, again, we're using Boomi as our middleware. We have a process that runs daily, say it runs overnight. It takes marketing and sales data from Salesforce, and this is sort of a simple example, but there oftentimes would be other source applications. Our Boomi job would extract the data. It would transform it using some business logic or mapping, and then it would load it into our data warehouse. In this example, we're using Postgres, which is just a relational database, and we could be reporting on engagement analytics. So again, very different type of structure than our previous publish and subscribe model. And both of these examples, our publish and subscribe model and our ETL model, are both supported by our middleware tools. So quite a bit more sort of flexibility and options for two very different types of use cases. All right, so our third example is platform as a service. So these are tools that folks are probably familiar with: AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. Okay, so these are not specifically integration tools. These are very big platforms that allow tons of services, tons of different services. AWS has at this point, I think almost 200 or maybe more than 200 individual services around creating databases, programming, networking, all these different very kind of low-level services that can be pieced together to build applications, or in our case, to build integrations. So to use some examples here, AWS has a service called API Gateway, which is used to sort of API networking and accepting data into AWS. EventBridge, which is kind of like an event bus technology within AWS. Lambda, which is a really popular sort of serverless programming runtime where you can write Python or Node.js code and do processing or transformation or build applications within AWS. Azure has similar services. Google Cloud Platform has similar services. I would also include in this, and this is probably not exact, but I'd include it in here, is I would put the Salesforce platform in this platform as a service bucket as well, in the sense that we can use Apex to build like custom REST services. So the ability to sort of build sort of custom services that we can use for integration purposes. Salesforce doesn't have sort of the level of services that these ones above have, but for our purposes here, kind of putting this in a category, the Salesforce platform, I would actually put in this list as well. All right, so as I had mentioned, these platforms are the most technically complex, or can be the most technically complex of the three categories I mentioned. These tools are much more developer oriented, much more pro code oriented. There are a ton of services available. I will quickly actually share my screen. And if we look at AWS, I did not count these, but there's just tons of services available, which are very low level services compared to what we get with Salesforce. So we've got services that do database, we've got services that do, let's say, compute. So this is like programming. So we've got Lambda, which we can use to write code. We've got EC2. Um, we look at networking. We've got API gateway. So there's just a ton of capabilities here. And we can use these capabilities to build pretty much anything we want. The trade-off is it's technically more complex than the more basic tools that we talked about earlier. So lots of services available. Um, a use case where people kind of use like AWS as an integration platform is oftentimes they're already using AWS within their enterprise somewhere else. So if I'd say generally speaking, if you don't have any integration capabilities right now, and you're not using AWS, you probably wouldn't be looking at AWS as like your kind of standalone middleware tool. It's usually when we're talking about the integration space, it's something where the company already has AWS. They're already using it. They're already have experience with it and are using services elsewhere. And particularly coming from a Salesforce background, it's important to understand that a lot of times these services are consumption based. So the more you use them, the more your costs go up. So with AWS, there's a free tier, and then you start paying. Um, that's a very different model than a lot of kind of the core Salesforce CRM licenses and those kind of things. So it's important to understand that consumption-based pricing, how it will impact you, what kind of volume you're going to be dealing with or you expect to deal with, and how that will translate into costs. Okay, so this is an example of using Salesforce and AWS for an integration. I actually took this from a really great blog post on the Salesforce Architects blog. The author of this is Evan Koch. And what this diagram illustrates is using, using AWS to back up I shouldn't say old Salesforce files from records that have been sort of closed out or completed or are historic. So I'll zoom in on this so we can take a closer look. I'll try to zoom in on this so we can take a closer look. All right. I can't figure out how to zoom in, so we'll just look at it this way. So in Salesforce, in this example, we've got, let's say Salesforce accounts. Or I think in this example, we're actually they're using Salesforce opportunities. Okay. So we've got opportunities, and then on the opportunity, there are files. And what they want to do is after the opportunity has been, let's say, closed won and is no longer being worked, they don't want to leave the files in Salesforce because they're paying for that storage. They're not going to be using those files anymore. So what they want to do is once that opportunity is closed, they want to take that file, they want to move it out of Salesforce, and they want to put it on Amazon Web Services AWS S3, which is a object storage, sort of bulk object storage service that folks are probably familiar with. And so this this integration does a few things. So I'll walk through kind of what it does at a high level and then the AWS services that it's using. So basically what is happening here is when our opportunity is closed, we have a file that is passed, or sorry, a record that is passed to AWS. AWS Lambda, which I mentioned before, is what they call a runtime or programming language runtime. It's basically, you can think of it as like a container that you can use to write Python code or a container that you can use to write Node.js code. So it's basically like for folks familiar with Apex, it's like a container that you can use to write code basically, and it's on AWS. And so when our opportunity is closed, that information is that notification is sent to AWS. AWS, our Lambda function retrieves the file, an identifier for the file, and then this process grabs the file, archives the file that's in Salesforce, stores the file that was in Salesforce on S3. So we've got Lambda that we're using to do the processing, the logic, the coding, S3 for the storage, and we've got AWS Secrets Manager, which is managing the Salesforce credentials here. And I would definitely, this is a really interesting use case and a really, the Salesforce architects and Evan Koch did a nice job writing this up in some good detail. So I definitely recommend that you check this out. Really interesting example of how you can use AWS. And this is a good example because like I mentioned before, this would be something where this company is already using AWS. Okay, they already have familiarity with it. They're already using S3 and they're using Lambda to AWS Lambda and some of the other AWS tools to create that integration between Salesforce and S3. All right, so those are our three types of tools: task automation tools, middleware, and platforms. Some additional resources for folks that want to go deeper. So on the left-hand side, these are more kind of abstract. They're more about patterns. These are a little bit more specific. So on the left-hand side, great web page resource on the Salesforce developers site, which is 6 integration patterns. If you're looking to learn more about integrations with Salesforce, this is a really great place to start. On the Salesforce Architects site, there is a data integration decision guide. This is also an awesome resource. And from Apex Hours, I think this was from last year, Mitesh Mystery did common Salesforce integration scenarios and solutions. This is also a awesome resource. Mitesh goes through some specific scenarios, goes through the architecture of how those scenarios can be solutioned. So great resources here. And then on the right side, some resources that are kind of specific to some specific technologies. So the first one, integration success with AWS and Boomi. This was done by a company called Big Compass. They're kind of an integration consultancy. This webinar that they did was great. They have a bunch of other really good webinars on their YouTube site. So if you're interested in kind of going deeper in integration, not necessarily on the Salesforce platform, but integration in general using either platforms or using middleware or integration platforms as a service, I definitely recommend the Big Compass YouTube site. Migrating Salesforce files to S3 with AWS Lambda. This is the article that I had mentioned before, written by Evan Koch, and it's on the Salesforce Architect blog. And then the last item here is Salesforce Event Relay and AWS Event Bridge. That's a typo. Oops.
But you'll get kind of the picture on.
Oops. There's no space in Event Bridge, but Salesforce Event Relay and AWS Event Bridge. This is a great presentation by Nadina Lisbon at the Salesforce Architects Group from April, from last month. So if you're interested in checking out, learning more about Event Relay or AWS Event Bridge, you can check that out. So awesome resources here. If you want to go deeper, I definitely recommend you check out these resources. All right, so questions and answers. So Amit, I think we got some questions we're going to go through.
Thank you so much, Brian. Good question, great session. We have some question. Uh, can we use this tool as a one or more together?
Yeah, good question. So one of the things that we got a number of sort of pre-questions, and one of the, I'd say kind of the assumptions or themes of some of those questions was this idea of like, okay, our organization is going to use one of these types of tools, and that's what we're going to use, and that's the only tool we'll use. And maybe if you're using like maybe one of the middleware tools, right? Like if you have Boomi or MuleSoft, that may be sort of it may be the case that you have that one type of tool. But what also happens commonly is organizations have more than one of these types of tools. That company, Big Compass, that integration company, they use this term hybrid. You've got a hybrid, you're using a hybrid environment where you have multiple of these tools. And sometimes you're hybrid by design, where your organization makes a conscious effort, conscious decision to use, different tools in different places. But probably more often what happens is over time, companies may acquire other companies, and the original company is using MuleSoft, but the other company has maybe some things in AWS that they built out, and they sort of get this sort of hybrid environment that way. Or it may be a result of sort of different departments within the company or different regions doing different things. So I'd say sometimes there's a situation where your company might have just one of these tools, but oftentimes by design or by kind of happenstance, you may have more of a hybrid approach. And that's kind of the reality of sort of the modern enterprise.
And
So
one more question.
yeah,
Yep, one more question. Should those configurations should be done by a developer, or we need some integration guide to do all these integrations?
yeah, I'd say if you're a Salesforce professional, um, it is generally important, assuming you have an integration team or a team that's um, sort of technically capable of building out these more complex things. You want to be working with that integration team, even if you're using something simple like one of the task automation tools where you do have the ability or the familiarity to build it out yourself. It's something where, since we're talking about multiple applications, it's important to bring all the parties together, the sort of the business stakeholders of these various systems, the technical stakeholders. If you do have an integration team, obviously bringing them in. So the purpose of this presentation was for Salesforce people to understand what capabilities and what types of tools exist out there. But it's not to say that Salesforce professionals should now be sort of going out and doing this stuff solo. You definitely, for both technical and organizational reasons, you want to bring in the right stakeholders on this.
And how do the platform even fit into these tools?
Yeah, so one of the other, in the questions that you shared with me, one of the other sort of questions or themes, assumptions that came up was like, well, we know that Salesforce has platform events. Don't platform events do a lot of this stuff? Why do we need integration tools? Don't platform events integrate? And platform events within Salesforce are really valuable tool and sort of an event-driven architecture. I'm not going to go into what sort of specifically how they work here, but they're not, and they're commonly used in integration use cases, but they're not integration tools. Platform events isn't an integration tool per se. Like platform event doesn't authenticate to another system. It doesn't share information with another system. It doesn't transform data across systems per se. It's something that identifies that an event has occurred within Salesforce or elsewhere, and it's used to trigger something to happen. But it's not an integration tool per se. It's not like middleware or the other tools that we have here. So platform events would work in some of these, would be a part of some of these scenarios, like using MuleSoft or using Boomi in a sort of pub sub type of architecture, but a platform event itself isn't going to do the integration.
Okay, one last question. It is possible to get the developer edition for these tools?
Yeah, so again, there was a bunch of tools that I discussed today. I'd say if you're interested in any of these tools, for many of them, there are kind of a developer edition, or they might call it something else, trial edition. I know with Boomi, there is, I don't know if they call it a trial, a 30-day trial, or a developer edition, but it's it is possible to use these tools and test them out, try them out. And I'd say with particularly if you're relatively new to building integrations, creating sort of a developer environment and trying a proof of concept or building out a proof of concept can be really, really valuable to kind of getting a sense for how the tool works, where it works as expected, where there may be things that you hadn't expected with your particular use case. So if possible, it's really beneficial to do those proofs of concept and get a developer edition or a trial edition.
Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing your knowledge. I hope this is helpful for our audience.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Simon. It was great to be here with you today.